Good morning. Chinese tariffs on U.S. goods are going to go up now from 34 to 84% starting tomorrow.
Beijing's Commerce Ministry accuses the Trump administration of blackmail and says his tariffs are a typical unilateral bullying practice.
In what many are now calling a turning point in the U.S.-China trade war, Beijing has quietly made a move that could have far-reaching global consequences. On the surface, the headlines may not seem dramatic. China has announced export restrictions on a handful of rare earth elements. But these are not just any materials. The elements targeted are critical for a wide range of high-tech industries, defense systems, and clean energy technologies. And they are materials that the United States, among many others, relies heavily on China to supply. The announcement came in early April 2025, shortly after the U.S. administration imposed additional tariffs and moved to tighten restrictions on Chinese technology companies, including Huawei. In response, China issued new controls on the export of several rare earth elements, as well as gallium, germanium, and antimony. These three materials, in particular, are essential components in semiconductors, military-grade electronics, and green technologies like solar panels and electric vehicle batteries. Though the action stopped short of a total export ban, Beijing's new rule limits the issuance of export licenses for these materials. In practice, this creates a bottleneck. Companies that previously relied on a steady flow of these materials are now faced with major delays, price spikes, and uncertain access. That's enough to cause concern for industries with finely tuned global supply chains and just-in-time production systems. What makes this move particularly impactful is that China dominates the rare earth industry. Despite the name, rare earth elements are not especially scarce in nature. They're found in many parts of the world, including the United States. But extracting and refining them is expensive, complex, and often environmentally damaging. That's why China, which began investing heavily in rare earth mining and processing decades ago, now controls around 70% of global rare earth production and an estimated 90% of the world's refining capacity. This monopoly gives China enormous leverage. In theory, even a subtle change in export policy can have massive ripple effects across international markets. And that's exactly what seems to be happening. Shares of U.S. rare earth companies spiked immediately after the announcement, as investors rushed to reposition ahead of possible shortages. Meanwhile, companies that rely on rare earths for critical functions, like aircraft manufacturers, chip makers, and electric vehicle producers, were left scrambling for alternative sources or contingency plans. Several of these companies have remained publicly silent. Industry leaders such as Boeing, RTX, formerly Raytheon, GE, and Apple have yet to issue formal statements. But behind closed doors, it's likely that internal reviews and risk assessments are being urgently updated. Few sectors are untouched by rare earths. They are found in everything from wind turbines and hard drives to guidance systems, drones, and missile components. Gallium and germanium, two of the more high-profile elements now under Chinese control, are used in chipsets and fiber optic communication systems. These components are essential in both civilian and military tech. Antimony, another restricted mineral, plays a key role in batteries, fire-resistant materials, and even night vision equipment. By limiting the flow of these resources, China is not simply responding to tariffs, it's placing a strategic chokehold on future-facing technologies. Analysts and intelligence firms have pointed out that China's move appears to be carefully calculated. Rather than a blanket ban, the export restrictions are being framed as part of a licensing process, which allows the government to maintain flexibility and avoid breaching WTO commitments. At the same time, it sends a strong message. China is willing to use its dominance over rare earths as a bargaining tool in broader trade and geopolitical negotiations. For the United States, this development has exposed a long-standing vulnerability. While there is one rare earth mine currently active in the U.S., the Mountain Pass facility in California, the country still lacks the refining capacity needed to process the raw material into usable components. That function is still outsourced, mostly to China. In fact, even some rare earths mined in the U.S. are shipped to China for processing before being re-imported as finished materials. The situation has sparked immediate concern in Washington. Lawmakers and industry leaders alike have warned for years about overdependence on Chinese resources. Now those warnings are playing out in real time. National security experts are particularly alarmed. Many of the restricted materials are integral to defense manufacturing, meaning that any prolonged shortage could have direct implications for U.S. military readiness and technology development. President Trump responded quickly. On April 7th, just days after the Chinese announcement, he warned that if Beijing did not withdraw its retaliatory measures, the U.S. would impose another 50% tariff on Chinese goods. He also stated that negotiations with China were over and that talks would instead be pursued with other trading partners. The move suggests a hardening of the U.S. stance and potentially a longer period of decoupling between the world's two largest economies. At the heart of this is the growing recognition that global supply chains are more fragile than they once seemed. The idea that any single country could control the flow of materials that fuel the world's most important technologies has forced governments to rethink their strategies. Rare earth elements may not be well known to the average consumer, but they are absolutely essential to modern life. Disruptions in supply, even for a short period, could lead to price volatility, project delays, and shortages in everything from electric cars to smartphones. The U.S. does have some reserves of rare earth elements, and there are emerging efforts to build out domestic supply chains. Companies like MP Materials, Phoenix Tailings, and USA Rare Earth are all working to develop end-to-end production and recycling capabilities. However, these efforts are still years away from achieving scale, and they currently lack the depth and capacity to meet domestic demand on their own. Until now, the rare earth issue has mostly flown under the radar, discussed mainly among experts and supply chain analysts. But China's move has brought it into the mainstream. Investors are taking notice. So are regulators. As more attention is paid to the underlying materials that power the technologies of the future, rare earths are likely to become a key focal point in discussions about national security, industrial resilience, and economic independence. Back in the 1980s, China recognized the strategic value of rare earths long before most other countries. The Chinese government introduced a series of support measures including subsidies, export incentives, and reduced environmental regulations. These policies made it significantly cheaper for companies to mine and refine rare earth elements within China compared to other countries. As global demand for high-tech products grew, China steadily built up its capabilities and started exporting rare earths at competitive prices. By the mid-1990s, China was producing more than half of the world's supply. By 2010, it had reached near total dominance in processing and refining. This wasn't just about access to raw materials. It was about refining them into the usable compounds required for everything from smartphone magnets to missile guidance systems. Many countries, including the U.S., found it more cost-effective to buy refined rare earths from China rather than invest in expensive domestic alternatives. Over time, that convenience became a dependency. One of the most pivotal moments in the rare earths timeline came in 2010. After a territorial dispute with Japan, China sharply reduced its rare earth exports. The result was immediate and dramatic. Prices for rare earths shot up, in some cases several times over. Global manufacturers were caught off guard, and for the first time, governments realized just how vulnerable they were to supply disruptions. That event sparked years of debate in the US, Europe, and Japan about the need to diversify supply and reduce reliance on China. But despite that wake-up call, few countries made significant progress in changing the status quo. Environmental concerns, high production costs, and long timelines made it difficult to compete with China's scale and efficiency. China's strategic edge only deepened. It refined its policies further, banning foreign ownership of rare earth mining assets and requiring joint ventures for any company wanting access. This allowed Chinese firms to gain valuable foreign technologies while maintaining control of the domestic industry. Export quotas were introduced in the late 1990s, incentivizing the export of finished rare earth products rather than raw materials. This helped move more of the value chain inside China. Although China ended its formal export quota system in 2015 after a WTO ruling, the country maintained its position as the global leader in rare earths. Today, it still supplies the majority of the world's refined rare earth materials, while also holding key positions in magnet manufacturing and other rare earth-related components. Fast forward to the present, and the consequences of that long-term strategy are playing out in real time. The recent restrictions announced by China may not be full bans, but they are enough to significantly disrupt international supply chains. Sectors most at risk include electric vehicles, clean energy technologies, consumer electronics, and especially defense. Elements like dysprosium and terbium are critical in the manufacture of high-strength magnets, which are essential for EV motors and wind turbines. Without a stable supply of these elements, production lines can stall. Technologies that many countries are relying on for climate goals could face setbacks. And with countries aiming to ramp up EV and battery production, any delays now can affect market development for years. Then there's the impact on defense. Advanced weapon systems, satellites, radar components, and jet engines all rely on rare earth materials. If the supply of these elements becomes uncertain or politically constrained, national defense capabilities could be directly affected. That's one of the reasons why the U.S. government has listed rare earths as critical to national security and why recent moves by China are being taken so seriously. Beyond the U.S., other countries are also beginning to feel the pressure. Japan, South Korea, and several European nations are heavily reliant on Chinese rare earths. Japan, in particular, imports significant quantities of materials like lanthanum and neodymium for its car and tech industries. In the past, Japan has been among the first countries to push for rare earth diversification, even partnering with Australia and Vietnam on exploration projects. But so far, these alternatives have not scaled enough to make a significant dent in China's dominance. And China's position isn't only about having raw materials, it's about having the infrastructure to process and refine them at an unmatched level of efficiency. Processing rare earths is an industrially intense process. It requires complex separation technologies, trained labor, and environmental risk management. For many countries, building this capacity from scratch would take years, even with strong political will and investment. In the current climate, even the threat of export restrictions has begun to alter market behavior. Companies are reviewing their sourcing strategies, revising supplier contracts, and reassessing their exposure to critical mineral bottlenecks. Stock prices for rare earth firms outside of China have surged, while those with heavy exposure to Chinese inputs have faced sharp declines. There's also a growing concern about rare earth processing machinery itself. Much of the equipment used in the refinement of these materials is also made in China. That means even countries with potential mining resources may still rely on Chinese machinery and technology to build domestic supply chains. The web of dependency goes deeper than just access to raw minerals. With pressure building, the United States has begun to act. Recent years have seen renewed interest in rare earth independence. The government has backed recycling initiatives, supported research into alternative materials, and provided funding for domestic mining operations. But these efforts are still in the early stages, and building a fully self-sufficient supply chain is a long-term project. The challenge is not simply to extract rare earths, but to develop full end-to-end capabilities, from mining and processing to component manufacturing. That's a far more complex and capital-intensive task than many realize. And it underscores how carefully China has built its position over the past 4 decades. So far, China's current restrictions are limited and targeted. But the message is clear. If economic or political pressure continues, it has the tools to hit back hard, without firing a single shot or disrupting a single shipping lane. By quietly tightening control over a few critical materials, China can create global ripple effects that shift the balance of trade, weaken industrial output, and force diplomatic recalculations. The question now is how other countries will respond. Will they double down on rare earth independence? Will they invest heavily in domestic capacity, even if it comes at a higher cost? Or will they seek new partnerships with resource-rich nations that offer a path away from China's orbit? In Washington, there's now a clear consensus across political lines. The U.S. must develop its own reliable supply of critical minerals. This includes not only rare earths, but also materials like lithium, cobalt, and graphite, all essential to batteries, electronics, electric vehicles, and clean energy systems. Over the past several years, both the Trump and Biden administrations have introduced measures to address this growing need, though with slightly different approaches. Under the Trump administration, the focus was on increasing domestic mining and processing capacity. tariffs were used as a tool to push companies to source materials from within the US or from trusted allies. Environmental regulations around mining were relaxed, and financial support was directed toward companies willing to invest in critical mineral projects. The message was simple: rebuild America's industrial capacity and reduce exposure to geopolitical risk. The Biden administration expanded on this by placing even greater emphasis on clean energy and technological self-sufficiency. Executive orders such as Decree 2017 highlighted the urgency of securing domestic supply chains for critical minerals. Major legislation like the CHIPS and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act provided financial incentives for companies to build supply chains at home. These laws also encourage partnerships with allied countries to create a more resilient and distributed mineral sourcing network. The U.S. Department of Energy and Department of Defense have both taken active roles in this transition. Programs such as Title 17 and the Advanced Technology Vehicles Manufacturing (ATVM) loan program have been redirected to support domestic extraction and processing projects. New public-private partnerships are forming to scale up rare earth recycling, improve refining technology, and support research into alternative materials that could reduce reliance on high-risk inputs. Outside the U.S., other countries are following suit. The European Union has unveiled its own Critical Raw Materials Act, which focuses on developing local mining capacity and diversifying import sources. Japan, which has long been one of the most exposed economies to rare earth volatility, has partnered with countries like Vietnam and Australia to secure long-term supply deals. India, Canada, and South Korea are all actively investing in critical minerals exploration and processing, often in coordination with the US and Australia in particular, has emerged as a key partner in this effort. With large reserves of rare earths and a stable regulatory environment, the country has become central to US and EU strategies for reducing Chinese dependency. Several Australian mining firms are already exporting rare earths to partners outside of China, and new projects are being fast-tracked with government support. These efforts are also being coordinated through international alliances. The Mineral Security Partnership, MSP, which includes the US, Canada, Australia, the EU, and Japan, was created to align strategies, share resources, and build infrastructure that can support non-Chinese supply chains. Another effort, the Quad Critical Minerals Partnership, involves India and seeks to promote regional stability and resource access through coordinated investment. But rebuilding supply chains takes time. Rare earth mining and processing is not a simple business. It requires capital, technical know-how, and long-term commitment. Environmental and regulatory challenges also play a role. Communities must be engaged and sustainable practices must be built in from the beginning. That's why these national strategies are not just about opening mines. They're about creating entire ecosystems, from extraction to finished product. Recycling is one area of growing interest. Companies like Phoenix Tailings in the US and Urban Mining Initiatives in Europe are exploring how to extract rare earths from old electronics, magnets, and industrial waste. While not yet scalable enough to fully replace mining, these approaches could play an important role in reducing demand pressure and improving sustainability. At the same time, innovation in materials science is opening the door to possible alternatives. Research into substitute materials for rare earth magnets, batteries, and semiconductors is ongoing. Some companies are experimenting with new magnet compositions that use less dysprosium or neodymium, or even no rare earths at all. Others are investing in solid-state battery technology that reduces dependence on lithium and cobalt. These innovations won't eliminate the need for critical minerals, but they may soften the impact of future supply shocks. From a broader geopolitical perspective, the rare earth issue is now part of a larger trend toward economic rebalancing. Many countries are reevaluating the risks of concentrated supply chains, not just for minerals, but for pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, and energy components. The COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine both underscored how quickly disruptions can ripple through the global economy. In that sense, rare earths are just one piece of a much larger puzzle. This shift also reflects a new kind of competition, one focused not only on trade, but on control of the technologies that will shape the future. From electric vehicles and renewable energy to quantum computing and advanced weaponry, Access to critical minerals is a prerequisite for innovation and security. It's not just about market dominance, it's about geopolitical positioning. China understands this well. Its decision to restrict the export of gallium, germanium, and key rare earths is not just a response to US tariffs. It's a demonstration of power. A way to remind the world that global production still flows through Chinese infrastructure. And it's a test to see how quickly and how effectively other countries can build alternatives. So far, the reaction has been swift. Investments are rising, new partnerships are forming, but the road ahead is long, and China is not standing still. Beijing is continuing to invest in rare earth efficiency, new discoveries like the one in Yunnan province and the vertical integration of its supply chain. Its lead, built over decades, won't be easy to displace. Still, the trajectory is clear. Supply chain resilience is now a global priority. Whether it's through mining, recycling, innovation, or international cooperation, the aim is to reduce exposure to choke points and ensure stable access to the building blocks of modern life. As these policies take shape and new supply networks begin to grow, the world will likely enter a more diversified but also more competitive phase of resource management. It's not about cutting China out entirely, but about making sure no single country can hold the world economy in its hand through control of a few key materials. In this new era, rare earths are no longer just industrial commodities. They are strategic assets at the heart of a new kind of global competition. How governments, businesses, and investors respond to this reality will shape the future of everything from national security to climate policy. So where does this leave us? China's move has forced a global reckoning. It has raised hard questions about how much control is too much and how prepared the world really is for supply chain shocks. In the months and years ahead, we'll see whether these wake-up calls translate into real resilience or whether the cycle of dependency simply shifts to a new form.